Let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, Lord, always more ready to hear than we are to pray, and are wont to give more than we desire or deserve. Pour down upon us the abundance of thy mercy, that we may ask and think good things that please you through the merits and mediation of our accomplished and victorious Redeemer, Jesus Christ. Amen. Now turn to verse 5 of the Advent hymn 59. Honor, glory, might, and blessing to the Father, the Son, and with the everlasting Spirit, while unending ages run. Well, we've got a grandkid living in days, so I have a few interruptions here and there. We turn now to Rufinus. It's commentary on the Apostles' Creed, translated and annotated by the famous J.N.D. Kelly, principal of St. Edmund's Hall at Oxford, published by Westminster Press. In London as well as in Westminster, Maryland. It's got the Nihil Obstat imprimatur, Archbishop of Washington. Commentarius in Symbolum Apostolorum. I've got a long 169 pages. It's got a couple of editors. Catholic University, Pontifical College. Paging through here. It's got an introduction to the author, commentary on the Creed, the Baptismal Creed, Rufinus, and the Bible, the canon, Scripture. We'll have to watch how they deal with that. And it's got the text, goes through the confession, catechism. He was about 345-ish, 340-ish in birth. Died about 410, so he's a contemporary of Augustine and Jerome. Some say he's a little bit on the rough side. He's got the nickname Tyrannus Rufinus. He was born about 345 in the small North Italian town of Concordia, ahead of the Adriatic, not far from the west of Aquileia. The son of Christian parents, he was sent as a youth to Rome to complete his education. Just to make it a little bit bigger here. Formed ties with another northerner about the same age, Jerome, strident in Dalmatia. Probably in 368, the year of St. Jerome's departure from the capital for the semi-barbarous banks of the Rhine, Rufinus to northern Italy, attaching himself to the community of ascetics, which had sprung up at Aquileia under the inspiration of the exiled St. Athanasius during his sojourn there about 345. Same year he's born. But you can imagine they had quite a history there. Within a year or two, he was formally received into the church, being baptized by the priest Chromatius, who was later the bishop of Aquileia. Meantime, he became friendly relations with St. Jerome, who seems to have been a frequent visitor to the monastic house. But this phase of his life so potent. Can you be quiet, please? But this phase of his life so potent in planting him in the vision of ascetic perfection was not destined to last long. 372, Jerome suddenly broke away from the group, setting on a pilgrimage which took him through Thrace, Bithynia, Pontus, and eventually to Syria. Rufinus, too, sieged with a similar longing to visit the authentic home of monasticism. He embarked on a journey to Alexandria and Egypt, Somewhere about this time, Rufinus's fortunes became linked with those of another devout seeker after the higher spiritual life, the rich and noble Roman widow known as Melania the Elder. After a 6 months visit to the desert fathers of Nitria in Lower Egypt, we find him settled with her at Alexandria, where he attended the lectures of Didymus the Blind and made the acquaintance with the works of Origen. So we really have to get back to Origen, because he influenced so many people, for better and for worse. And just what proportion that is pending before the jury. As I told you, we had two grandsons running around today. A happy problem to have. We do our work here Saturdays too. During the Arian persecution, which flared up after St. Athanasius' death in 373, he apparently suffered imprisonment and exile. In the meantime, Melania had taken herself to Palestine and had established a community of virgins in Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. Interesting. Here, Rufinus rejoined her probably about 380. I'm trying to work. You guys, please. Okay. For the next 18 years, this is 380, they labored together, entertaining bishops, monks, and virgins with lavish hospitality, and pursuing literary studies as well as supervising their religious houses. Please, guys. Okay. I don't want to say it again, okay? Okay. Yes, Mom. It was during this period, about the year 390, Rufinus received ordination to the priesthood, probably at the hands of John, Bishop of Jerusalem. Up to this point, Rufinus had led an inconspicuous, though busy life. With thoughts dominated by the dream of monastic dedication and self-renunciation. Now he himself was thrown into a bitterly conducted quarrel about Origen and the orthodoxy of his theology, and incidentally became an author. The first rift between himself and his boyhood friend St. Jerome dates back to 393. He would have been 40-ish, 50-ish, 393, closing in on 50. For such it was becoming in a certain strict circles of Origenism. While St. Jerome was prepared to offer formal abjuration of the errors alleged, Rufinus declined to make any defense. Much more serious was the attack which a little later St. Epiphanius launched against Rufinus's friend Bishop John of Jerusalem. Rufinus rushed to John's support, while St. Jerome sided with the aged and stiffly conservative St. Epiphanius. A reconciliation was nevertheless patched up, and complete amity had been restored between them when Rufinus, I'm not sure how to say it, I'll just say Rufinus, maybe it's Rufinus, yeah, Bishop Herder would like that accent, since we've got a short vowel in the Latin on the penultimate syllable. You shift it in as far as you can. Rufinus set sail for West in 397. Once in Italy, however, Rufinus took up the task of translating Greek theological writings into Latin, and at the request of the Arianite philosopher Macarius, produced a Latin version of Origen de Principiis. In view of the anti-Origenistic atmosphere of the times, this was a tactless move, but he made matters much worse by claiming that he had adhered to St. Jerome's methods, and by attempting to whitewash Origen with the plea that the heretical blemishes disfiguring his works were the result of interpolation. St. Jerome's reaction was typically violent, and a chasm yawned between the two old friends which the efforts of well-wishers proved powerless to bridge. In addition to his private dispute with St. Jerome, Rufinus now found himself faced with public doubts as to his orthodoxy, and he was obliged to address a reasoned defense of his position to the reigning Pope, Anastasius. And I don't think it went by Pope at this point. If Gregory's letters, Gregory I, they didn't call themselves that. Is this revisionist history? We haven't had this question. As we know, Rome, those who conquer, write the histories. So we have a right to ask these questions. Now faced himself with public doubts as to his orthodoxy, he was obliged to address a reasoned defense of his position. Worse still, the abuse and vituperation with which Jerome continued to belabor him until his death were to darken his reputation for succeeding centuries. About 398, he would have been what? 43? 45? 45? 44? No, 55. Returned to Aquileia, where the spiritual guide of his youth, Chromatius, now occupied the see. Here he embarked on a period of strenuous literary activity, producing, in addition to controversial manifestos, a series of translations of Greek ecclesiastical authors, not excluding Origen, as well as original works of his own. It was probably a happy as well as creative interlude in his career. He enjoyed the friendship and confidence of such men as Bishop Gaudentius of Brescia and St. Paulinus of Nola, as well as other church leaders in the region of Venetia and Milan. The outstanding figure of the age, St. Augustine of Hippo, never faltered in his esteem of him and refused to take sides in the acrimonious quarrel between Jerome with St. Jerome. But in 407, Chromatius died, and Rufinus took his final leave of Aquileia, making for Rome and the monastery at Pinitum, near modern Terracina, for which his friend Ursacius presided as abbot. Political upheavals and the military invasion of the Goths did not make North Italy a comfortable locality for an aging man, and it is possible that his thoughts were turning once again in the direction of Jerusalem. His intended route required him to travel over Africa by Sicily, and he was on the island with Melania the Younger, the granddaughter of his sometime spiritual companion, and her husband Penianus, when Alaric's hordes moved southwards after the sack of Rome. There's a moving passage in the preface of his translation of Origen's homilies on Numbers, describing how, looking across the straits towards Italy, he had witnessed the burning of Reggio. That's right on the Straits of Messina. Been by, don't know how many times. Not 100, but easily 50. Used to do that. We go up to Naples, then come down the east side of Sicily. That was in September 410. He was then suffering badly from eye trouble, and shortly afterwards died. A malicious sentence of St. Jerome's prefixed to his commentary on Ezekiel, written in 411, establishes the date and confirms that Sicily was the burial place. Though in keeping with his fiery temperament, St. Jerome's insistence on carrying the quarrel beyond the grave was in every way unfortunate. Intellectually, Rufinus was no match for him, but he was a good man, and he certainly conducted his side of the controversy with more dignity and Christian tact than his hot-blooded opponent. The outline of his personality is lost behind his writings, but seems to have been humble-minded and retiring, with intense ascetical bias, which was typical of the age. He had the resolution and firmness of character to stand up for principles when they were attacked, and with the unhappy exception of St. Jerome, it is remarkable how steadily he won and retained the affection of his Christian contemporaries. 2. The commentary on the Apostles' Creed. Rufinus cannot be claimed as one of the great Christian writers of the 4th century, belonging to the epoch which produced such geniuses as St. Ambrose and St. Augustine. I want to get some Ambrose's stuff too going. Check that out. Not to mention only the West, he would have been the first to admit the mediocrity of his stature. Nevertheless, despite inevitable limitations, his literary achievement ought not to be underrated. The great body of his writings consisted of translations, and on these his reputation as an author must rest. His translations of Origen are particularly important, including as they do the De Principiis and the commentaries on Canticles and Romans, as well as a host of homilies. In addition, he published versions of Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, St. Basil's Regulae, and a number of his sermons, 9 orations of St. Gregory Nazianzen, the Historia Monachorum, and several other works. As a translator, he followed principles which would not gain acceptance today. Often his renderings were loose paraphrases or even shortened adaptations, and in the case of Origen, he did not scruple to modify or suppress passages which he mistakenly supposed to have suffered alteration or interpolation at unorthodox hands. It would be unfair to judge him, however, by standards which may be de rigueur in the 20th century, but which were not so strictly imposed in the 4th and 5th. On the positive side, the service he rendered to the Church by making Eastern ascetical and theological developments accessible to the Latin-speaking West must, on any reckoning, be acknowledged to have been substantial. The original writings, standing to his credit, are singularly few. The Apology of Anastasius and the Apology against Jerome, 2 books, continuing the narrative of Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History from 325 to 395, 2 books, De Benedictionibus Patriarchum, and some letters and commentaries which have not survived. To this list must be added the Commentarius and Symbolum Apostolorum, which is what we have here, which is perhaps the most important of all his works, and in which was to exercise wide influence. In the Middle Ages, it was generally handed down under the name of either St. Cyprian or, ironically enough, St. Jerome, a circumstance which may account for the popularity it enjoyed in spite of the cloud overhanging Rufinus. That he was in fact a true author admits of no doubt. Its stylistic and doctrinal affinities with his other writings are transparent, and there is early testimony to his having written about the Creed. John Cassian, for example, made explicit reference to an Expositio Symboli by Rufinus, following up with the textually exact quotation from chapter 13. Less than a half a century after Rufinus's death, Gennadius of Marseille noted that by his own efforts, the same Rufinus produced an exposition of the Creed, in comparison with which all the attempts of others scarcely count as expositions at all. The Commentarius is addressed to a certain Bishop Laurentius. His rank may be deduced from the respectful title Papa, which Rufinus applied to him. He it was at whose title the little work was undertaken. Nothing further is known of his identity. The conjecture of J. Fontanini that he was the Bishop of Concordia, Rufinus's birthplace, was only a guess, and the fact that there's no definite record of any occupant of that see prior to Clarissimus, AD 578, perhaps militates against it. Even less plausible is D. Villarsi's suggestion that Laurenti in the manuscripts may be misreading for Gaudenti. It is true that Gaudentius, the contemporary bishop of Brescia, belonged to Rufinus's circle of personal friends, and that the latter dedicated his translation of the pseudo-Clementine recognitions to him. But quite apart from the difficulty of explaining the corruption of such an obvious and easy reading of Gaudenti into the enigmatical Laurenti, there seems no justification for assuming that the list of Rufinus's acquaintances is exhaustively known to us. It is usual to date the commentarius round about the year 404. The text of the treatise itself contains no pointer to any particular epoch, but the close similarity between the discussion of the resurrection body given in chapter 43 and the treatment of the same theme in his two apologies has been taken to imply that it must be posterior to them. The Apologia ad Anastasium is ascribed to 400, and the Apologia in Hieronymum, that's Jerome, in 401. If these dates are correct, and if the argument founded on them is trustworthy, the book may well have been composed 2 or 3 years earlier than 404, but anything approaching an exact dating is excluded by the lack of precise evidence. The particular literary genre to which Rufinus's essay belongs was by no means unfamiliar to his contemporaries. He himself remarked in his opening paragraphs that he had forerunners in the same field. Half a century previously, 347, 348, St. Cyril of Jerusalem had delivered his famous catechetical lectures. 13 of these, in addition to the catechesis, there were 23 catecheses proper, and the 13 in question are numbers 6 to 18, were based on the successive articles of the Jerusalem Creed, which in effect they paraphrased and expounded at great length. These lectures were widely read and set a model to subsequent writers. And set a model such as Galasius of Caesarea, 395, who included an interpretation of the Creed in the 9th tractate of the General Introduction to Christian Doctrine. The 5th of the 6 Libelli Instructionis, published by Niceta, Bishop of Ramanesia, in the latter decades of the 4th century, and like Rufinus, a close friend of St. Paulinus of note, also consisted of an exposition of the baptismal creed for the benefit of catechumens. Yet another example is the Explanatio Symboli ad Initiandos, a tract not dissimilar to Rufinus's, though much briefer and of a more limited scope, which should probably be regarded as notes of a lecture delivered by St. Ambrose to candidates for baptism. St. Augustine, too, when he was still only a priest, addressed a gathering of bishops at Hippo on the Catholic faith, using the baptismal creed as the framework of his discourse and publishing it under the title De Fido et Symbolo, The surviving collection of his sermons also contained 4 addresses to candidates for baptism. 3 preached when the baptismal creed was handed to them, and the 4th on the occasion of their solemn rehearsal of it before the bishop, the Reditio Symboli. All 4 are succinct theological expositions of the creed in language adapted to the intellectual level of his audience. As it stands, Rufinus's treatise reads smoothly and freshly, has all the air of being an original work, though by no means so brilliant with his pen as his relentless critic St. Jerome. Rufinus wrote a skillful and sometimes attractive style, and he had the ability to leave his personal imprint on whatever material he handed. Yet it is plain that even in his commentaries, he did not rely exclusively on his own invention. In the nature of the case, since he was expounding the creed for converts and others undergoing instruction, he drew largely on the church's stock of catechetical commonplaces. Over and above that, there were at least 2 literary sources which he had made his own, and from which he deliberately borrowed. One was the Oratio Catechetica of St. Gregory of Nyssus, a reasoned defense of the main doctrines of Christianity against heretics, Jews, pagans, written sometime prior to 385. The influence of chapters 32 and 6 of this work is discernible in chapters 14 and 15 of Rufinus's essay. Again, there can be little doubt that its teaching lies behind other sections as well. Much more striking and all-pervasive, however, was the impact of St. Cyril's catechetical lectures. No source, it has recently been pointed out, has so far discovered the first 13 and last 3 chapters of the commentaries, but the remainder of the work is largely based on catecheses 13 to 18. The measure of its dependence should become vividly and convincingly apparent to the reader as he studies the text with the appended notes. Here it is sufficient to observe that, while Rufinus often makes fresh points and appeals to illustrations of his own choosing, he is indebted to St. Cyril for the sequence and framework of his exposition, for a great proportion of his arguments, and for the majority of his scriptural quotations. It would not be unfair to describe his treatise, or at any rate the main body of it, as rather free, drastically abbreviated presentation of Latin of St. Cyril's teaching in the catechetical lectures. And here we will bring it to an end. A 9th century hymn for Advent, hymn 60. Creator of the stars of night, our people's everlasting light, O Christ, Redeemer of us all, we pray you hear us when we call. Let us pray. Blessing and honor, glory and power be unto him that sitteth upon the throne, and unto the Lamb, forever and ever. Amen. Godspeed.